I want to talk about a subject which I feel is very important and it's timely, and that is the issues around police power, law enforcement power, accountability, and what role we as society expect them to have in our society, in wider society. With this, I'm not going to be focusing on any particular case, although there are obviously high profile cases going on at the moment, such as Philando Castile in the United States. But if you'll excuse me, I don't want to focus on an individual case, but rather wider issues around how I feel about this, the subject of police power. If you follow my channel for a while, you'll know that I have very strong views on antisocial crime. That is the sort of crime that can really, really wear people down and impact people's lives. So, with that, you would expect me to be absolutely in favour of an all powerful police force. So, it may surprise some people that I'm not, and this is why. I believe that if we want the police to apprehend dangerous people, if we want the police to keep the public safe, then common sense dictates that they need the power to do so. So I absolutely support that. But when we're talking about police and power, it has to be the right sort of power. If there's one thing I hate, it's abuse of power. I hate all abuse of power, but with the police, it's particularly problematic, especially in cases where you have armed police or you have police who, for example, are involved in anti-terrorism and so on. What I find is that there's two extreme attitudes to this, and I think both are a problem. So, on one hand, you have this extreme, often far left, but not unanimously, attitude that basically goes along these lines. And by the way, I'm going to apologize up front in this video because I'm going to be speaking very candidly, and that's going to require using some colorful language to basically describe what I'm talking about. So, you have this far left kind of idea like all cops are pigs, right? They're all corrupt, they're all the same, they're all killers, they're all racists, so we hate them all. This mentality is utterly unhelpful to anyone. I can understand when something happens it can heighten emotions, but in the UK context, for example, there has actually been big improvements made since the 1980s in terms of police representation from the ethnic minority communities. And in my opinion, one good thing Theresa May done as Home Secretary was stop racial profiling. I understand some of the rationale behind it because if you get an area, for example, where there is a higher rate of incidents, say, committed by black suspects, then you could argue that the police are using common sense. However, I can see why it's problematic because then you get a situation where innocent black guys feel that they too are being victimized, and that's inevitably going to increase suspicion and mistrust. So I think she done the right thing by stopping that. As Home Secretary, she has the power to do those sort of things. Had, I should say. Um, so I think in this country the situation has improved in terms of race relations with the police, but I still think there's some way to go in terms of. Let me say this up front. I think that the British police are a lot better than some of their international counterparts. But anyway, I'm going off on a tangent. So I mentioned you have this far left extreme attitude that they're all the same, they're all bad, and we hate them all. The problem with that attitude is it not only is generalizing an entire group of people, so it's a bit hypocritical because it's doing the very thing that they are opposing. They say the police target all minority people, but then you're saying all the police are the same. So it's hypocritical. But the other thing about it is sometimes that then morphs into actually defending criminals, low life thugs who should not be defended by anyone. So I'll give an example of this. I know I said I didn't want to go too much into examples, but I've noticed Black Lives Matter and other groups have went out of their way to defend Michael Duggan, the guy whose death led to the England riots 5, 6 years ago. Now, by all accounts, this guy was no saint. He had a regular history of violence. He had arrests for possession of weapons. He was involved in drug peddling. I know uh, people have defended him. There's actually a tribute video to this guy from people calling him a fellow soldier. Now, in London slang, this is basically a term that gangs use to kind of praise their fellow gang members. So that's a real problem I have with some critics of police, that they then end up just glorifying criminals. They end up glorifying thugs and lowlifes who should not be glorified. And they allow their hatred of the police to blind them that actually there are thugs out there who the police people should absolutely get behind the police in in tackling. That's one of the biggest problems I have with Black Lives Matter. I think that if their whole message was about tackling police brutality and unlawful killings and that sort of thing, I would certainly have some sympathy. And when it started off, I did have some sympathy. But then they started going down the purely racial lines, and it was purely about every single time there was a case where a black man was shot by the police, it must be racist. So they didn't look at it on individual merit, they looked at it like one big slate. And I think that was a mistake because there were cases where suspects were armed and they did have a violent record. There were other cases, as we know, that were absolutely inexcusable. For example, what happened to Eric Garner. I think that was appalling. Um, so that's one extreme where you get people who hate the police and then they end up just making excuses for criminals. And if that's your message, I have no time for you and have no respect for you because I have just as deep a contempt for those sort of criminals as I do for police abusing their powers. But then you have the other extreme, and it frankly usually comes from right wing and conservative sources that automatically believes the police and automatically assumes that because someone is in uniform, they're not capable of being corrupt. That because they're in uniform, they can never be wrong. I think that is an incredibly ignorant and regressive mindset because the fact of the matter is, and the police themselves will acknowledge this, and that there is corruption in the force. Not that there's a single force, but the police as a concept, I don't think there's any police force in the world that is entirely 100% clean. Some are better than others, but you get some countries where extrajudicial killings is a massive problem, and where police are basically paramilitaries, and they're little better than the terrorists and the gang members that they're taking on. So I do have a problem with that mindset as well. That when someone complains about the police, oh, they must be some sort of communist, they must be some sort of hippie, they must have done something to deserve it. I have personally had hassle with the police. I've never been roughed up or anything like that, but I have had to deal with situations where the officer just showed no sympathy, was incredibly obnoxious in their outlook, and I do not accept this idea that all police are um, decent people who are. I think there are frankly some rotten apples within the police force, and whether it's from being desensitized because of the sort of work they do, or whether they think that wearing a uniform gives them a green light to do what they want, I think it might be a bit of both. Um, it's a problem. If your attitude is that they're always right and the police should be able to do whatever they want, it's an attitude I sometimes see coming from the United States. I see people things like, "Oh, if he just complied, he wouldn't have been shot." But we know for a fact that the police are capable of corruption. They are capable of planting evidence on someone to cover themselves, and they are capable of protecting their own when they're accused of things. So, if you're a truly open-minded, reasonable person, you will acknowledge that some officers are corrupt. And I find too many right wingers are automatically of the opinion, or will, when someone's complaining about the police, they must be guilty. If that's your mentality, then you would be in favour of a police state, and you do not believe in freedom and democracy. So, those are the two extremes as I see them. Now, that having been said, I do believe that the majority of officers, at least in this country, I can't say that about other countries. I believe, like I say, in other countries there is a paramilitary situation. I believe in Britain, from my own experience, my honest observations, I genuinely believe that most officers are decent people doing a very difficult job. Very often they do need to deal with very dangerous individuals that the rest of us would not encounter on a daily basis. Police officers go towards the danger when the rest of us either want to get away from it or try to avoid it. They have to deal with some very stressful situations when they're dealing with angry protests, when they're dealing with people yelling in the face. It is a very, very difficult job. So, to that extent, I do have a lot of sympathy for police officers. And I myself, instinctively, the way I've been brought up and my mindset is that if I'm speaking to an officer in public, I treat them with respect. However, I also expect them to treat me with respect. And I do feel that sometimes there is a situation in the police. It could be, again, because they've been desensitized to the sort of world that they're seeing every single day. I think sometimes they lack sympathy for victims of crime. In my own experience, I've had that problem where I'd been assaulted by some drunk on the street, so I reported it. I'd done the right thing. A lot of guys would just get into a fight. I done the right thing. I went to the police. The officer's attitude was, "Oh, you're just a pesky student." And if you're a police officer and you don't sympathize with victims of crime, you're in the wrong job as far as I'm concerned. Because ultimately that is the issue. They do have a very difficult job, but no one is forcing them to do it. They can resign at any time they want. So I don't really accept this argument um, that they're in a difficult job, therefore you can never criticize them. Yes, they're in a difficult job, but it's a difficult job they have chosen. That's the point. Um, and the problem is when they give this indication that they protect their own, then that destroys public confidence because it makes the public think that there is institutional corruption. In the UK, we have something called the IPCC, Independent Police Complaints Commission. It's a very, very important thing. I personally feel it could probably be strengthened. It could probably go further. Without that, you would have a situation where you would have to basically trust the police to investigate their own abuse. And I think, unfortunately, too much of the time they would be more willing to cover it up. That sounds like a very cynical thing to say, but frankly, there have been too many historic examples of that happening. So there are good officers out there who would want to do the right thing, who know what's wrong, and who I mean, I remember I had spoken to two officers about that incident. Obviously, very angry about it. They basically admitted it. They were community beat officers, so they didn't have the power of arrest or anything like that. Nevertheless, they were police officers, and they basically said, "Unfortunately, you're right. There's some, as they put it, stinkers in the police." And so, if I was a detective superintendent or a police commissioner, I would make it one of my absolute priorities purging those sort of corrupt officers. Any officer that felt he or she could abuse their position, I would be ruthless because you need to be ruthless in an organization like that, which relies so heavily on public trust. It should be a case that the police and the public are working together against criminals. But unfortunately, when you get examples of abuses of power, let's say, for example, you have an officer who is being overly rough with a protester. I am aware that you get violent protesters and have no respect or sympathy for them, but you've also had examples where there are non-violent protesters who, frankly, have been manhandled by the police in a way that is unacceptable. Again, so much of it comes down to balance. The democratic right to peaceful protest must be protected, and the police must bear that in mind. On the other hand, the police have a right to protect themselves from violent anarchists. So I would appeal to my fellow members of the public. You need to look at this objectively. You need to try and understand both sides. As members of the public, we have a right to expect that the police act in a professional manner and that they show victims of crime sympathy. I think part of the problem is, especially with young men, they automatically assume if a young man is a victim of crime, oh, well, he's got into a fight. I don't think they have any sympathy. And I think that's a big problem because, on one hand, they say, don't take the law into your own hands, do the right thing, go to the police. People then go to the police, and more often than not, their attitude stinks. They don't show sympathy, they don't show any patience, and it's what they need to understand is that they may be dealing with this every single day, but the average victim of crime is not. And I think sometimes there is a desensitization there, and they just lose all. I mean, I'm not suggesting that it's their job to wrap people in cotton wool, but at least have some semblance of sympathy. And like I say, my own experience, and not just that occasion, I've had it on other occasions, was just really not they couldn't really be that bothered. And perhaps that's an unfair perception, but they have to be constantly aware that when they're dealing with the public don't go out and want to be victims of crime, and they deal with this stuff every day. So it's not good enough being desensitized. Um, so for me, I find myself in a position. On one hand, I hate what gangs and criminals do, and I do want the police to have the power to apprehend these people. On the other hand, I do hate abuse of power as well, and I don't think that's a contradiction. And I don't think it's a case of putting the police in an impossible position. It's not rocket science. It's really not. What the public want is the police to basically, to make it simple, take on the bad guys and don't target innocent members of the public. Don't abuse your power. I would even say with so-called petty criminals, I would feel uncomfortable, for example, if you had someone accused of theft from a shop and then the police beat them to a bloody pulp. Yeah, I would feel uncomfortable about that. It would clearly be excessive. I think there have been far too many cases of people dying in police custody with basically no results. I think it's good that we have the IPCC in this country, but I think it could probably go further. And I find it deeply disturbing. In the United States, as far as I know, there's no independent body except the media. I've been critical of the media, but without that media pressure, I have no doubt a lot of American law enforcement agencies would just cover themselves. And it would absolutely. I think the only reason, for example, they released the footage of the Philando Castile incident is because the public anger of previous incidents has been so much that they don't want to go through that again. I think there's been too many cases stateside of trigger happy cops thinking they can do whatever they want. If anyone's wondering why I keep focusing on the US, I know it's not the only country and I don't believe it's the worst. There's parts of Latin America and Asia where the police really are basically no better than terrorists. But it's because, again, so we look to America so much because it is the world's superpower, and so often America boasts about being the greatest nation on earth. So I think it's a fair barometer to look at a nation and look at how law enforcement acts there. I mean, I don't know all the issues, and that's why I'm trying not to pontificate on individual cases. But this is something that affects absolutely everyone, including, incidentally, the police themselves. Because, put it this way, if you have a corrupt officer that brings their force into disrepute and they're not punished, this is actually a very important point, then it turns anger against the police as a whole, so their actions actually hurt their fellow officers. That's a point worth considering. But I do think it is extremely important that when an officer abuses his or her position, I think one thing that infuriates people, and this is something in the UK we have not gone far enough in. If an officer, for example, is accused of assault, I don't think it's good enough that they're put on desk duty. Anyone else accused of assault will be arrested on suspicion of assault. So an officer accused of assault should be arrested on suspicion of assault. There has to be a perception of a level playing field. I do not agree that the police should have special rights because that then leads to the sense that they can do whatever they want. And that breaks down trust. So I believe that if an officer is accused of something, yes, sometimes they might be innocent. But you know what? Then they would have their their due process like anyone else. So I don't think it's a knee jerk reaction. I think it's a fair reaction. If an officer assaults me, because maybe I've lost my temper because I felt that he or she wasn't handling my case well, and then they're basically let off the hook. I would feel infuriated. And frankly, I have heard of cases where victims of crime have been treated like dirt because the officers just didn't have the patience to deal with them. That's unacceptable. And if you're a police officer and your heart's in the right place, then you will agree with me. I think there's still too strong a perception worldwide that the police cover themselves. And it doesn't help when you get people in senior positions basically saying, constantly defending their officers. They need to come out and say, we will not tolerate our officers abusing their position. They need to say that clearly and publicly. And if they don't, then it starts to look like a freeway situation, the law abiding public versus criminals versus the police. It should be the police and the law abiding public on the same page. And unfortunately, it isn't always the case. So, anyway, I've spoken for quite a while here. Let me know your thoughts. For me, what this all comes down to is balance. And I'll summarize with this. I think the police do a very difficult job, and I think most officers are brave people who do deserve respect. But where there is corruption, where there is abuse of power, I think that is utterly unacceptable. No excuses. No excuses. And I believe that people in senior positions need to take some responsibility, publicly say, we will not tolerate officers abusing the position. So far, I don't think they've done enough in that regard. I think they could do a lot more. And for me, that means that when an officer abuses his or her position, putting them on desk duty is not enough. Putting them on paid leave is not enough. They need to be arrested like anyone else would be. That might be radical, but I think that's what it takes. Um, because one corrupt cop is one too many. On the other hand, to those anti police extremists who think that they're all killers, that they're all racist, etc., and if your attitude is to defend drug lords, defend gang leaders, and then you expect the wider public to feel sorry for your cause, what I want is a situation where the police are empowered to take on actual criminals, to take on the drug lords, to take on mafia bosses, to take on these scumbags. In that regard, I'm 150% behind the police. But it is so important that the power is in the right place and it is directed at the right people, i.e., high level criminals. Okay, thank you for watching. Let me know your thoughts.